very, very warm welcome to our presenter, Mr. Shoes Mehta, and bird coloration, the hows and whys.
Thank you, Rich, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. And so the presentation is going to be in two parts. Roughly the first 2/3 or so will deal with the how questions, and the remainder will deal with the why questions. I'd be happy to take questions at the end, but many of you have bird experience and bird knowledge, so please feel free to stop me anytime if you'd like to add a comment. I have 30 slides, and each slide is numbered at the bottom here, if you can read it, so you can keep track of our progress. This is not going to be one of those with unlimited numbers of slides. As we go through the first part, there are a few things to keep in mind about colors. They're primarily signals, not exclusively, but primarily. And colors of bare parts, meaning beak, legs, etc., can also be important signals. And the third thing to keep in mind is coloration is one of several signals that birds use. So in the second part, we'll see exactly what is being signaled and what these different signals are. So these are the two types of colors that are present in birds. The first is a pigment color. And pigments are what you would find in your car paint or in an oil painting. Let's say you had a red pigment, a pigment that looks red to you. When light falls on it, the red pigment absorbs all colors except the red, and the red is what is reflected into your eye. And pigments are just chemicals, basically. They're that absorb and reflect certain colors. We'll go more into this a little bit later. Structural colors are different. Pigments are not involved here. Light interacts with an ordered nanostructure, and here is an example of an ordered nanostructure. Nano because the scale here is hundreds of nanometers, and nanometer is very small. It's a billionth of a meter. And there's also the other thing to note is that there's somewhat regular arrangement of these blobs. We'll see later what these blobs exactly are. So when light interacts with a structure such as this, certain colors are scattered off of it, and that's what we see. And the microstructure per se need not have any color. So the types of colors in this room are mostly pigment, with the couple of exceptions, electronic devices, and the other exception is very interesting and very likely present in the room. It's a biological structural color, and we'll see what that is as we go along. So let's have a look at some birds. The blue jay on the...
I'm just going to turn this light off so we can see the colors better, if that's for you. And I'll leave that light on over there.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Karen.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. So the blue jay on the top left, the blue is entirely structural. The black on its plumage and also in its beak and its legs, we loosely call these legs. Beak and its legs are also melanin pigment colored. White is always structural, and you can see some black in the plumage as well. The American goldfinch, this is a male in breeding plumage, and the yellow is due to a pigment called a carotenoid, and we'll see what that is. Again, some black melanin pigment, some white. Note that the bill and the legs are pinkish yellow, and in breeding season, in breeding plumage, this is what they look like. At other times of year, they'll be grayish due to melanin. This is arguably one of our most colorful birds. I know some of you have seen this in Cape May, but it's typically found further south in Florida and south central U.S. It pretty much represents all the colors that we would see in birds in general. But notice one thing, it has a red eye ring. And this is very helpful to birders, the eye rings and eye colors for IDing birds. And a little later on, I'll have a slide on eye rings and eye color. The Atlantic puffin, which can be seen off the coast of Maine, has basically black and white plumage. Again, this is in breeding season. You can see that the legs and actually the webbing between the toes are very bright orange, as is the beak. Now, this is what the beak looks like under UV light, under artificial UV light, and some parts of the beak are glowing under this light, and we'll see later what this means. So light can be thought of as waves, and here is a wave, and the wavelength of this wave is defined as the distance between two successive peaks. Each color that we see, this is a spectrum of visible colors visible to us, violet at this end and red at the other, these colors are associated with waves that have different wavelengths. The violet waves have the shortest wavelength and the red has the longest. Even shorter than violet is ultraviolet. And these are the ranges here. This is the visible range of these colors measured in nanometers. That's the wavelength. And the ultraviolet, which we cannot see, is shorter than violet, which is the end of our range here. So actually, how do we see colors? At the back of our eye in the retina are specialized cells called cone cells. And these are depicted here as red, green, and blue because these are maximally sensitive to the wavelengths represented by red, green, and blue. And birds have the same three cones, but in addition, they have a fourth cone that detects UV light. So birds can see in the UV. Now, I should mention that sunlight not only has all the visible colors to us and to birds, but it also has UV. And birds will see, let's say, a UV marking on another bird by the reflection of the UV that's coming from the sun into their eyes. This is just a schematic showing our three cones. The wavelength is decreasing as you go up. These are our three cones. There's some overlap here. These are the visible cones for the bird. And this is shown kind of in magenta, but we don't really see that color. That would be the UV cone of birds. So coming to carotenoids, I mentioned that the goldfinch, the yellow of the goldfinch, the male goldfinch in breeding season, is due to carotenoid. What is a carotenoid? There's a molecule called beta carotene, which is present in carrots and other fruit, and that's where that name comes from. And that is the main or the prototypic carotenoid. There are several compounds, maybe even hundreds, that resemble beta carotene in structure, and they're all called carotenoids, and they're all colored. Now, so I bought a little packet of beta carotene. It comes from an algae, and I dissolved it in some rubbing alcohol. You can see it made a yellowish solution, and so this is beta carotene, but something very closely related to this is present in goldfinch plumage. So additionally, what happens is that some birds that, like the cardinal, for example, scarlet tanager, house finch, that have red pigments, these pigments, red pigments, are actually derived from yellow carotenoids by one enzymatic step, one enzymatic change, and that enzyme is CYP2J19. An enzyme is a protein that carries out a reaction in the body. And this enzyme is responsible for converting a yellow carotenoid to a modified red carotenoid. Here is the structure of beta carotene, and you can see it's a long chain and it's flat, and because of the length of this chain it can interact with light and give you a yellow color. The two places I've marked by red are the places where CYP2J19 modifies this to make it red colored. Compare this to the size of glucose, so it's a lot bigger. Okay. Oh, and also, you can make a solution similar to this by extracting carotenoids from feathers. You can actually extract yellow and red carotenoids into solution. The blue color for blue jay, you cannot. There's no blue pigment. You can extract melanin, which is a pigment, but it's a little more difficult because it's less soluble than carotenoids. So here's how we see a red male cardinal. The light from the sun falls on pigment granules, which are modified carotenoids that are red, and the red color is reflected off, the others are absorbed, and this reaches our eye. Strictly speaking, this is not entirely correct. What is bouncing off is a particular wavelength or a set of wavelengths. And these wavelengths excite one or more of our cones. And the brain is then interpreting this as a red color. So because of the similar physiology and anatomy between the bird eyes and human eyes, we believe that they're seeing these colors that we do. And in addition, of course, the ultraviolet. This is the northern flicker. This is the red shafted, which you see in the west. These are subspecies, the red shafted and the yellow shafted. This is present in the western US, and this in the east, and in the middle there's a hybridization zone. The genes of these two subspecies have been compared, and they're almost identical. One of the differences is that this yellow shafted is missing this enzyme that I talked about that converts yellow to red. Now going on to melanin. Melanin has many functions, and it functions in ways beyond just being a pigment, a pigmentary black color. Bless you. When we say melanin, we're really talking about polymers of melanin, which are eumelanin and pheomelanin. And the eumelanins serve as black, gray, or brown pigments, and the pheomelanins are earthy red and yellow pigments, and they're often found in combination. Melanin also, meaning eumelanin, protects against feather wear, and we'll see this in the next few slides. So here is one use of color that's not in signaling. Protects the eye, is part of the nanostructures for structural color, and we'll see this as we go along. It also protects bacterial breakdown of keratin. Keratin is the protein that feathers are made out of, and keratin plays an important secondary role in colors. It is the supporting matrix for pigment colors as well as for the nanostructures for structural color. So keratin is very important. Don't mix keratin with carotenoid. Keratin is a protein that the feathers are made of. Carotenoid is a yellow pigment. So here are some birds, and there are many such birds with black wingtips. The feathers at the tips of the wings are especially susceptible to wear and tear with the shear from the wind and so on. And this black coloration of the wingtips protects these wingtip feathers from degradation. There was a bird, I can't remember, it was a shearwater, I think. It was typically a black bird. And somebody found an albino shearwater. And its feathers were a mess. And it couldn't fly, and eventually it died. It was because it lacked the melanin that was protecting the feathers. And this is especially true in birds that fly long distances. For birds like the snowy egret, it doesn't really matter because they don't fly long distances. They spend most of their time in water. Here are a couple of dramatic examples of the protective effect of eumelanin. On the left are two starlings. This one here is in fresh fall plumage. It's just had a molt, and it's speckled white. Those speckles are actually the wingtips of these feathers. And what happens as time goes on is that these white wingtips wear off. And you're left with this black coloration, even though between this and this, no molt has taken place. Here's another example. It's a fossil feather, 100 million years old. And you might be able to see some impressions that the keratin has left. But after 100 million years, the melanin still remains. One of the reasons for the strength of eumelanin is that it's a polymer. And polymers tend to be more inert physically as well as chemically. So coming now to structural colors, here's an audio CD, just a normal audio CD, and here's just a flashlight, ordinary flashlight. I'm going to shine the flashlight on the surface, and you can see the colors that arise from this interaction of light with the surface of this audio CD. This is what the surface looks like under a microscope. It's got pits, and these pits encode the audio. And the spacing of these is of the order of about 1,000 nanometers. So this would constitute a nanostructure. When light falls on this, there's an interaction known as scattering. And the colors that we do see, structural colors in a bird plumage, like blue, only the blue is scattered off the nanostructure surface. And we'll see this in the next slide. I mentioned at the very beginning that it was important that the dimensions were of the order of hundreds of nanometers, and this happens to be the wavelength that falls within the range of the light that we can see. If these are the nanostructures in bird, producing bird structural colors, and these are melanosomes, which are particles filled with melanin. And they're different types. They're round, somewhat elongated, hollow, filled, and their spacing, their order, regularity is somewhat different. All of these determine which colors are scattered off these nanostructures. Now, scattering has a connotation of things going every which way, kind of randomly. In fact, the colors that we don't see are scattered like that, and they cancel each other out. And that's known as incoherent scattering. But the colors that we do see, such as the blue, are coherently scattered, meaning that all the waves line up and reinforce each other. They don't cancel each other out as they do here. And this is a paper from Dr. Stoddard, who's at Princeton. And she's correlated, she's showing here the type of the nanostructure composed of melanosomes that give rise to some of the colors in these birds shown right above these structures. Iridescence occurs when there is an angle dependence of the color that you're seeing. What happens is that two colors are coherently scattered at slightly different angles off these melanosome nanostructures. And so, depending on the angle at which you look at the bird, the color may appear different. An extreme example of this is the magenta gorget of, let's say, a ruby-throated hummingbird. At one angle it looks magenta, at another angle it looks black. That's kind of an extreme example. That is iridescence though. More often the angle dependence is very slight, and that's where you see shimmering or iridescence, such as in a peacock's feather. So this is to summarize what these different colors are, whether they're structural or pigment. White is always structural, but there are no melanosomes involved there. Only keratin-based structural color. We just talked about eumelanin and pheomelanin. Red also we talked about modified carotenoid, yellow carotenoid. Orange is a combination of these two. Blue is always structural. Green is a combination of yellow pigment and blue structural. And iridescence, as I mentioned. There's some exceptions to these. Some pigments that you find in parrots or in a bird called turaco, but they're relatively minor, so I'm not going to talk about that. So these are some structural colors that are found in nature. And this is the color that's very likely present in this room. Blue eye coloration is a structural color. And it's due not to melanosomes. None of these are actually based on melanosome nanostructure. It's based on a protein called collagen that makes the nanostructures in the iris and causes the blue color. Going this way, a butterfly uses chitin, which is a polysugar. This limpet, which is like I guess a snail, it actually uses calcium carbonate to make the nanostructure. That's nothing but chalk or lime. These eastern blue caterpillars are from tall pines. You'll be happy to hear. They have light blue and white coloration, and those nanostructures depend on actin. Here's a cuckoo wasp on my front porch. These berries are found in Africa, and they're supposed to be, when you look at them, a very deep blue. And in this case, it's cellulose that's making the nanostructures. I have a bird here from the Galapagos. Would you like to see it? It's the blue-footed booby. The blue on its bill is a little exaggerated, although it does during breeding season have a little bit of blue on the base of its beak, but its feet are turquoise. They have a blue a collagen nanostructure forming the blue. On top of that, it's got some yellow carotenoids, so it's really more turquoise, and it makes full use of this during courtship. Now, there's problems with, I'm going to set this here, there's problems with pigments, one of which is they fade with time and on exposure to sunlight, etc. The second problem is that they're not good for the environment. Think of all the pigment that's released into the environment when a car is junked or when a house is demolished. So researchers are trying to make much greener colors based on structure, and in research they've been very successful in making a bunch of different colors, but nothing that I've seen actually has been used on a large scale. So coming to UV, as I mentioned, birds can see UV markings on other birds because these markings reflect the UV that is present in sunlight. Now, we don't see in the UV, so how do we know that birds have those markings? There are a couple of different ways. One way is to use an artificial ultraviolet light, such as this one here. It looks a little blue because it's at the very edge of what we can see. Also, the filter and the LED are not perfect. They don't perfectly filter out all the visible color. So this is kind of a shortcut for humans to be able to visualize UV markings. And you can see on the left here, this is a budgie in UV light, and you can see the yellow glow. So the way this works for humans is that these UV markings will glow in colors that we can see. But how relevant is this actually to what birds are seeing? Birds do not see this glow. For one thing, this is a weak phenomenon, and in sunlight, this glowing would be swamped by the visible colors present in sunlight. So birds do see reflectance, and there are ways of measuring that. You can measure the UV that's reflecting off UV markings, as in the blue tit here, and you need instrumentation and a lab to measure this reflectance, but it's a very much more accurate way of assessing exactly what the bird is seeing. This is a kind of a curiosity. This is a saw-whet owl. It's under wings. Using a UV light, much like this, you see a red glow, and this is of no use at all to the bird. Being nocturnal, they don't see very much in the UV, and this is a way actually for people studying these birds to assess their age, because this red glow under UV light diminishes with time. I'm going to show you an inanimate object that glows under UV light. And I picked this because it's got a very interesting history and a very interesting name. This is a mineral that's dark gray, it has black spots on it, and it's called euperlite. This is found on the shores of Lake Michigan in the UP. And folks who live in the UP are called Upers. And the person who discovered this euperlite, not that long ago, just about 6 years ago, gave it the name euperlite and trademarked it. So that's not its mineral name, but nonetheless, it's popularly known as euperlite. So this is euperlite, and there's a mineral called sodalite inside it that's fluorescing. And if I took this out into sunlight, you're not going to see any glow because it's so weak compared to the bright light that's present. I have some other glowing objects which I can show you at the end if you're interested. Actually, many minerals glow with UV, and many rockhounds actually go out at night with a UV light similar to this. And the gentleman who discovered this in 2017 was out on the shores of Lake Superior, and he had something like this with him, and he was looking at all the rocks, and he found and named euperlite. Okay, so I'd like to move on now. Oh, this is just an aside. I saw a news item somewhere that said that in the new museum that's going to be up the street, the glass has UV markings, crisscross UV markings. And this is what birds will see, and this will help to prevent bird strikes. And humans cannot see UV, so it's going to look more like this. So coming to non-plumage colors, in birds we already discussed the puffin and the blue-footed booby. It waddles in its courtship. It waddles and shows off its blue feet. Yeah, kind of like that. And here's an interesting example. This is a snowy egret, and on the left it's in breeding plumage. You can see the wispy feathers in breeding plumage. Also its feet and its lores. The lores are the areas between the eye and the beak, and in this bird it happens to be flesh, are bright orange. And in non-breeding season, non-breeding plumage, these are yellow. By the way, this bird, the snowy egret, was almost hunted to extinction at one time because these wispy feathers were prized as to put in hats. It was very fashionable then. Eye colors. There's a huge diversity of eye colors, and we don't fully understand the function of those colors, whether they have a signaling role, at least for most birds. And we also don't understand what the pigments are or the structures are that make up these colors. There's one thing though, this is on the bird, I said there's no white pigment, but some birds that have white in their eye actually have a white pigment. In some birds, eye color changes in breeding season, as in this double-crested cormorant on the right, bottom right. You can see it has blue eyes, but amazingly enough, during breeding season, the inside of its mouth turns blue. And one of its courtship things that he does is present his gaping mouth to females during courtship. Eye color changes upon maturation in some birds. This could be a signal for how old the bird is, signal to other birds. And here's something amazing. Birds can expand and contract their pupils at will, and we cannot do that. And here is a flame bowerbird, and as part of its courtship ritual, it will successively expand and contract its pupil. So that one function we know for sure, and in cormorants and birds like it, that eye color most likely is a sexual signal. Some rare color aberrations. Now I have a question for those of you in the audience. Is this an albino cardinal or is it a leucistic cardinal? Think again. It's an albino because albinism only affects melanin. So it still has the red pigment, and you can tell for sure that it's an albino because of its red eye. A leucistic bird will not have a red eye. Also, its beak and legs are pink because of the lack of melanin. Here is an albino crow. Again, the pink eyes. Here is a cardinal that most likely lacks the enzyme that converts the yellow to red. This is a fancy name, and it's very rare, a gynandromorphic cardinal. What that means is that it's exactly down the middle, half male and half female. It's very rare. And this type of gynandromorphism is called bilateral, straight down the middle. Other animals, sometimes like butterflies and so on, have more of a mosaic pattern. Did you have a question?
Define leucistic versus albinos.
Albinism is generally a genetic defect, and leucism can occur during the lifetime because of injury or other things. It's not genetic, and leucism can produce birds that look all white, but you know they're not an albino because they don't have the pink eyes. The eyes look pink because you can actually the color of the blood vessels comes through because there's no black pigment there to prevent us from seeing that. And albinos actually have a really hard time. They can go blind, and because of their different coloration, they have difficulty finding mates. So they don't really do well in the wild. Countershading, I think we're all familiar with countershading, and these birds here, except those in the box, are all countershaded. and the principle, just very briefly, when you look at these birds from the bottom, let's say a predator is looking up at the bird, the light shade on the underside will blend in with a lighter background, and by the same token, if you're looking down, if a predator is looking down, the dark shading is going to blend in with a darker background. There's more to counter shading than just blending in. There's something to do with when it's on the ground, how counter shading makes it not appear like it's a 3D object. So these are two birds that are North American birds. They also both happen to be seen in New Jersey, can be seen in New Jersey. And this is in their breeding plumage. And these two have reverse counter shading, at least in this plumage, in the breeding season. And these look a little odd to us because we're not used to seeing reverse counter shading. I want to say a little bit about evolution. Exceptions like this are not that uncommon in biology. We tend to assume that in the present day we've reached some kind of apex of evolutionary perfection. But in fact, some species may be well suited to their environment, but others may have vestigial characteristics, things that were traits that were once useful but are no longer useful, and if it takes energy to keep those going, they will soon be lost. Others have maladaptive traits, and if they don't get rid of those, then the species will die out. And yet other birds will have some traits, maybe coloration, that are neutral, that are neither maladaptive nor adaptive. So to find an explanation for these things, when you ask these questions, you tend to assume that these are perfectly suited today to their environment, so why are they like this? And the answer is that we're just at a cross-section of evolution, which takes thousands, if not millions of years, and many species are in the process of evolving. So before we go on to the next section, I want to talk to you about cosmetic coloration. Now, once a feather comes in after a molt, when it's fully formed, it's a dead structure. It's no longer alive. So once the color has been put in during the molt, and once the feather is fully grown, it can no longer receive any color internally. Okay? The color that it has from the molt is what it has. So cosmetic coloration is defined as any pigment color, plumage pigment color, that is not laid down by a molt. And here are a couple of examples. These two vultures and the sandhill crane can be observed wallowing in mud that is rich in iron oxide. And they take on this coloration. And people believe that this acts as some kind of signal, either to other males or to females. And they take on this rust color literally because iron oxide is rust. These snow geese and trumpeter swans, they have similar iron oxide rust coloration on their heads and necks, but this is probably just coincidental from feeding in iron oxide rich waters. Now, humans also use iron oxide in cosmetics. So you can actually buy iron oxide. You can see here, this is a reddish brown powder, as you would expect. It's rust colored. And one of the uses that it's sold for is as a colorant in human cosmetics. It's safe for external use. And it's approved by the FDA as safe for external use. So birds are not the only animals that use iron oxide in cosmetics. Okay, so coming on to the next section. This section is about 20 minutes. We're on slide 23, so we have only a handful of slides to go. So let's start by looking at garden variety natural selection. And this basically takes place because genetic variants that arise spontaneously, and so these are mutations that can arise when the DNA is replicating and some errors are made, or external mutagens from the environment are causing the mutations. When some of these, one or more of these mutations provide a survival advantage that they're selected for. Many mutants are neutral, some are deleterious, but some will provide a survival advantage. And I've listed a few examples here of evolution that has occurred and is occurring in the time scale of 1 or 2 human lifespans. Oh, I'm sorry. And just to take an example of bacterial antibiotic resistance, this is cited a lot, and it arises because bacteria grow in huge numbers, like billions, and their dividing time can be as short as 20 minutes. So even rare mutations will be present because of the large numbers. And it will happen that some of these mutated bacteria will be resistant to antibiotics. So when humans apply selection pressure, which is the application of an antibiotic, all the bacteria that are susceptible will die off, and the mutations that gave those bacteria antibiotic resistance will thrive and will soon constitute the whole population. So survival of the fittest, that term survival, and this example of bacteria may lead you to think that this is a life or death thing. It is, but it's very much slower than what is implied here by these examples. So Darwin had a problem with in particular a peacock, and he couldn't figure out what survival advantages do bright coloration and fancy plumage provide. In fact, he thought just the opposite. Coloration would make these birds more visible to predators, and also if they had elaborate plumage, it would make it difficult to fly or maneuver in the air. So he could see no reason for these to be present. And here's a quote from him: "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick." It's amusing how his use of "makes me sick" is so close to our contemporary use of "makes me sick." But his point was, it made him sick because he couldn't fit this in with his main theory of evolution. It just didn't seem to fit. So he proposed that such characteristics were separate from natural selection and arise from and are propagated by something he called sexual selection. This is different from natural selection, and he had to propose this because these things just didn't fit in his main theory. To define sexual selection and reproductive success, a male bird with more elaborate characteristics, we're assuming for the moment that it's the males that are competing for a female and the female is doing the choosing. This is reversed in about 10% of species, but let's assume for the moment is the male that's displaying and the female is choosing. So male bird with more elaborate characteristics, brighter colors or ritual or song or plumage, outcompetes other males and is also preferred by females. So these are the two components of sexual selection male-male competition and mate choice. And when this occurs, both the male and the female will have reproductive success. This is another thing that's key in evolution, is to have reproductive success. What does this mean? So in the previous slide, we talked about survival of the fittest, but survival alone is not enough. You need to not only be able to survive, but you need to find a mate. You have to fertilize. The egg has to survive. The hatchlings have to be healthy, and they have to survive, and they have to have reproductive success in turn. So basically, it means reproductive success means success in passing on the genes of the parents. So the male offspring inherit the elaborate characteristics, and the female offspring inherit the preference to choose these characteristics, and this occurs repeatedly. Now, mind you, here we may not be talking about large differences. There may be subtle differences, but the female can tell the difference. So they're not hugely different, these other males that this particular male is competing with. So why do females choose males having these traits? So this is where we start to differ from Darwin's thinking. Darwin's thinking about choice, a female choosing a male, was mainly based on aesthetics. The female found these signals aesthetically pleasing. And today we, except for a few researchers, we don't really believe that. What we believe is that the coloration in these other signals, both to the female and to the competing males, are advertising some type of superiority. So what type of superiority? At least two kinds. One superiority would result in a direct benefit, and the other superiority is what is called the good genes hypothesis. And let's see what these mean. A direct benefit would be the male advertising, "Hey, I'm going to be a good parent. Marry me." That would be the direct benefit. The good genes benefit is that the male is advertising that he is in good health, and some of his good health is because of his good genes. And if you marry me, my good genes will be passed on to our progeny, and they in turn will be healthy and survive and have reproductive success and all that. So most of the time, as I said, 10% of the time, the mate choice is reversed, but most of the time the female is choosing. And it's because she is very much more invested in reproduction than the male. Sperm are plentiful, eggs are very few. Plus the female has to nurture the egg, lay it, incubate it. So she's very choosy. She wants the right male with the right genes, and also having a direct benefit of being a good parent, to be the father of her children. Two other important concepts in evolution, trade-off and cost-benefit balance. As Darwin saw, there's some liabilities to these ornamentations. As we discussed, increased visibility, etc. But this is offset by their reproductive success, which they have because of those colorations. So it's a trade-off, it's a cost-benefit balance. And in the balance, the reproductive success, the benefit outweighs the liability or the cost of these other things. And there's also a trade-off in terms of energy use. Energy in this context is metabolic energy, is the energy the organism gets from food, that the bird gets from food. And there's a limited amount of it, and it has to be put to good use. It has to be used to propagate and maintain traits that are in the long run lead to reproductive success. So there's another cost-benefit balance here, and that is in terms of energy use. Again, the allocation of energy to these ornamentations, the liability of that energy allocation is made up for by the reproductive success that's associated with those ornamentations. I just want to say something here that's, I think, kind of touches on the diversity of bird coloration. This cost-benefit balance can be different at different times in history or under different conditions. In the tropics, there's lush vegetation all year round, and there's plenty of food. There's fruit, and the lush vegetation provides ample opportunities for hiding, for camouflage. The temperature is hot all year round, no need to expend energy on thermoregulation. So these birds in the tropics are very much more colorful and have extravagant plumage because their cost-benefit balance is such that they have plenty of energy, plenty of places to hide, even if they have elaborate plumage. In colder climes, our birds tend to be have less elaborate ornamentation. This has actually been quantitated. There are some researchers who collected, I don't know, several thousand birds from from the tropics and from northern latitudes, and they examined the colors of each of these birds, and they found tropical birds are 30% more have 30% more ornamentation. So one of the results of these is that in colder climates, you cannot keep having that cycle, because at one point you'll reach a stage where the benefit no longer outweighs the risk. So the actual sexual signals in our birds tend to be a little bit more muted. And something as simple as the size of the black bib in a house sparrow can be a sexual signal. And the white that a junco flashes in its tail, that is also a sexual signal. It's been shown that female house sparrows find that the size of that bib, the bigger size more attractive. And the same with female juncos. They find the more white there is in the tail, the more attracted she is. We'll see, okay, so here it is. These are the different signals that I mentioned at the very beginning. UV coloration, in addition to the colors that we see and the birds see, coloration of parts other than plumage, song, rituals and displays, and odor. I just want to say a little bit about odor because it's fascinating. A lot of work has been done on this by Dr. Whitaker, and she published a book last year in which she talks about her findings and the findings of other researchers in this area. So it turns out that the source of the odor in a bird is the preen gland and the preen oil. And these can be measured and quantitated and characterized with sensitive instrumentation. Also, what she has found is that the odor is produced by bacteria that live in the preen oil or on the preen gland. Now, this may seem, and of course, odor has been postulated to have a number of signaling roles, so it seems really bizarre that a bird would co-opt a bacterially produced odor to use as a signal. It makes a little more sense if you know that these bacteria have to live on the bird's metabolites, which are excreted into and present in the preen gland. The bacteria actually use these for food, and these metabolites are an indication of the bird's health and also of its hormonal status. So here is a case where the odor produced by bacteria is a surrogate for the health and the hormonal status of the bird. The human situation is very similar. Our sweat has basically no odor, and yet we have body odor from underarm and other parts of us. And these odors are due to bacteria that live there, and they exist on steroids that are excreted in the sebaceous glands and other metabolites that are secreted in the sweat glands. So, I mean, it can be argued whether in humans these odors are signals or not. Maybe they were at one time in our evolutionary past. Maybe they're subliminal. Whatever the case, it's a very similar situation. The odors that the bacteria are producing are a surrogate for the metabolic state, our hormonal status, basically. Oh, and here, why are there so many signals? Perhaps they're signaling different things, or in different ways they're signaling the same thing. Here is an example that suggests that at least some signals need to be considered together. Elaborately plumaged male bowerbirds build less elaborate bowers, and this might be a less elaborate bower. A bower is a structure made on the ground with twigs and so on, and often the bowerbird, the male, will decorate this bower with pretty colors. It's been found that the birds with the elaborate plumage build less elaborate bowers, and the opposite is true. The less elaborately plumaged bowerbirds build more elaborate bowers. So here's an example that suggests that the plumage and how impressive the bower is, they have to be taken into account. The female actually comes and inspects the bower, and it's really not a nesting place. It's just a structure that the male uses to impress the females. So these same signals act to attract females and also act as intimidation or dominance or territorial signals to other males. And these are all under control, either at least partly or indirectly, by testosterone levels. Testosterone levels, as displayed in these signals that it controls, also predicts the male's parenting ability. And this is the direct benefit. Too much testosterone and the male bird is not a good parent. It's off fighting or trying to find mate with other females. And too little testosterone is also not good for a parent. He's not effective in defending territory or warding off predators or bringing food. So the level of testosterone, as evidenced by these signals, can give some idea to the female of direct benefit, and these same testosterone levels can act to intimidate other males. Okay? And these are both components of sexual selection. So just a little bit about testosterone. Its levels change seasonally, and it also controls inter-female competition when mate choice is reversed. So females that are competing with other females for a male actually have testosterone levels that are as high or higher than the males. And I'll come back to this in the next slide. Its biological role, that is the role of testosterone, can be studied in a correlative kind of way. You can measure it in blood under different conditions, maybe looking at a variety of males with different plumages, measuring their testosterone level in the blood and making a correlation. You can also look at it in a causative way. You can actually implant testosterone and see what it does. And I think it was a fairy wren that was a female that was implanted with testosterone, and it acquired some of the colors that the male would have, and also became more territorial. Okay, just a couple more slides. So testosterone is fine and dandy to explain male-male competition and good parenting skills, but what are the links between good genes and outward signals, the signals we've been discussing? These links are not very clear. I just want to briefly outline 2 experiments that have been done that try to get at these links. In the song sparrow, there's an area in the brain, the nucleus, that is responsible for the song. And if this is not fully developed, the mature bird has a lower quality song. In song sparrows, when they're young, if they have a stressful childhood, lack of food, poor parenting, the growth of that song nucleus is stunted. When it's grown up and looking for mates, it is in bad health because of the poor childhood, stressed out childhood it had, and it has lower quality song. And females will not pick that bird based on its song. Here's another example briefly. The young of peacocks of different degrees of ornamentation were studied. The survival of those young was studied, and it was found that the offspring of the peacocks that had the more elaborate plumage had longer survival. And it was also found that the ones that didn't survive actually died of infection. So here is something that's saying, my ornamentation is telling you that I have good genes which result in a good, robust immune system, which when passed on to our offspring will result in their having a good immune system and survival, ward off infection, become have success in reproduction, and so on. Just a couple of things I want to mention. As I said, Darwin initially said basically the choice was due to aesthetics. And there's one scientist today, Richard Prum, who embraces that theory. And there's a lot of issues. He's like a lone voice. And there are a lot of issues with this, one of which is the anthropomorphism. How can we know what the bird is finding aesthetically pleasing or not? Handicap principle is another thing that is useful to know in thinking about these kinds of issues. The handicap principle states that only birds in good health have enough metabolic energy, to produce all this ornamentation and these exotic signals and plumage and so on. That's the handicap principle. That's basically saying if you have these traits and they're elaborate, you're in good health, so the female will like you. Now, this aesthetic evolution, of course, there's no need for any of this other stuff. They just say, oh, it's an aesthetic choice the female is making. This is the last slide. Sexual dimorphism. The term, as it has been used, has a human bias and also has a visual bias, because typically what we meant when we said sexual dimorphism is a difference in observable characteristics such as plumage color or body size between males and females. Now, to birds themselves, there has to be sexual dimorphism of some kind in their world, because they have to be able to tell apart males and females. So it's been suggested that UV markings can provide such sexual dimorphism in two birds themselves, and odor is different in females and males, and that's possibly This is looking at a broader definition of sexual dimorphism and looking at it from the bird's point of view. So the odor, song, UV markings, these are things that humans cannot easily discern, and they are therefore provide sexual dimorphism from the point of view of the bird. Here is an example of reverse sexual dimorphism. This is the male and this is the female. So there are the 3 or 4 things that go together. The female is more colored. She has more testosterone. And the other thing is that the parenting role, this male does a lot of the parenting duties, including sit on the nest. This is an example, as you've all seen, I'm sure, of sexual dimorphism in a red-winged blackbird. So after all these wordy slides, I want to end on a more colorful note. The artist Jane Kim has, over a space of a couple of years, painted this spectacular mural at the Cornell Labs. And this is just an outstanding tribute to bird diversity and color. And there's actually a companion book, which I brought with me. If you'd like to have a look at it after the talk, please feel free to do so. And thank you. I'll try to answer questions. We have other experts here who can help out.
So, how about the leucistic and albino situations? Can that be passed on genetically, either one of those?
Sure.
You know?
It can, in principle, be passed on genetically, but I don't know if those birds have reproductive success. They might not be able to find a mate, they may not live long enough. But it could be a mutation that arises spontaneously and not necessarily passed on, but if it does have progeny, yes, it can be passed on. Leucism is not gene related. Did I answer your question, Debbie?
Yes,
Eric.
This is a kind of a wild question. I don't know if you've seen any research. So in the last, I guess, 15, 20 years, the big thing in human genetics has been epigenetics.
Yes.
The idea that surrounding the chromosomes, which are relatively unchangeable with rare mutations, but surrounding the chromosomes you have a sheath of protein which is susceptible to change. And so change in one generation from environmental factors can be passed on to at least several future generations. I wonder if there's been any research on epigenetic changes in birds and bird color and so
on. Not that I've seen, but that doesn't mean it's not there. In humans, that's been studied. There was a famine in Sweden a couple of generations ago, and it was found that there were epigenetic changes were passed down. I thought of that when I put up this example of the compromised song in Song Sparrow. That is not a genetic change, but epigenetically it could be passed on. So it could be both a bad gene or bad parenting thing, which could be passed on epigenetically. And epigenetic changes can be inherited outside of the gene. Does that answer your question? I really haven't seen a lot of literature, but I haven't looked extensively.
I have a silly thought about hummingbirds, the ruby-throated. So a lot of us are using the red-colored sugar water, and I wonder if that, not the carotene, but the pigment somehow will eventually give us brighter or more red ruby-throateds.
The ruby throat is purely structural.
Okay.
And do you put red in the water?
We don't, but
No, just from
we,
the,
yeah.
it's contained.
But you can buy it that way, and a lot of friends do that.
Yeah. I don't know anything about
I
that.
wonder
But I do know that the ruby throat has a
so
structural.
it might not affect it.
Any other questions for Shirish? Thank you. So very much. I hope this